last October, this lunatic came on the phone. I knew he was a lunatic, you know. I mean, you can tell by the way he speaks. Durham Light Infantry, you know. I've known Paul, at least by reputation, since the mid-70s, I suppose. And the only difference between him and me is that he is a professional lunatic and I'm merely an amateur lunatic. There is one other difference. I get paid for my lunacy and he doesn't, which I suppose makes me a professional lunatic and him an amateur lunatic. The pleasure, actually, of being here this afternoon and knowing that during those years there was actually somebody out there listening, and listening in an appreciative way as opposed to an engineering way, is very rewarding. And equally interestingly, at the time, had I known about you as a group, were that possible, it perhaps would have had a very significant difference on the way that the programs, because that's what they were put together. However, at the time, as is ever with the BBC, there were effectively no resources in order to respond to those of you who were kind enough to write in anything more than a pretty sort of preemptory way. One of the greatest disappointments, to me at any rate, as a customer service orientated person, was that whenever you wrote in, and we were picking at about sort of 20 to 30 letters a week, there was no way in which we could ever satisfy your requirements, because what you ultimately wanted was the music, and the one thing that we weren't empowered to give you was the music. For a start, the BBC didn't own it, and frankly, the letters that came in were an unfortunate imposition, you know. I mean, most people like getting fan letters. We were saying, oh God, there's another pile of letters. What do we do with this lot? And to those of you who either telephoned or made contact with the BBC or whatever, who got a dusty reply, I ought to apologize to you in the context and the knowledge of 1990. But in the context and the knowledge of the mid-70s, in the nicest possible way, your enthusiasm for what is an obsession, I mean, you all accept that, don't you, really? Along with me as an appreciator of fulfilling that obsession, was frankly a pain in the arse, fellas. You know, putting it on the line, that was the difficulty. And it was more of a pain in the arse because it was frustrating, because we couldn't help. The BBC is a public service organisation. In its way, is committed to helping its audience. You know, fulfilling, satisfying, that's it. Why do you go into broadcasting unless it's to communicate with people? And the very act of communication, as you've proved eminently here this afternoon, is to fulfill other people's needs of your communication to them and vice versa, right? However, the Beeb in its glory was, so far as this element of programming was concerned, was a one-way operation. To the computer people among you, you know, it was definitely not interactive, was it? Right? It was one way. You got what we gave you. And we gave you, in many cases, as little as it was possible to give within the realms of a job which was the Foreign Recordings Department. I wonder if I can just go back to a bit of history. Good heavens. I think it's that Condor moment. I just hope the smoke detectors don't go off. Yes, well, I can see what an obsessive fellow you are now, really. Yes. He's one of these chaps, you know, that goes into the club and produces the pipe that is twice as large as anybody else's. Yeah. Why foreign recordings? Anybody know? Does anybody know? Why foreign recordings? Yeah? Any other reason?
Well, contractually, I understand that the two stipulations were, first of all, it mustn't be available commercially to the public, and it had in those days to come from outside the country which intended to broadcast it.
But why? What a lunatic thing to do. Why?
Save money.
Yes. Why else? There was a real problem in really after the war, when the country was sort of rebuilding itself. We're all aware that there were unions building up and there were managements, if you like, building down. And what everybody was actually trying to do was to build for a better life, I should say, after a period of what had been deprivation. And by and large, you know, if a union went to its management and said, we want a better deal for our guys, there was an element of sympathy about it. You know, I mean, if you take the example of independent television, you know, later, but in the 50s, the government applied a levy on profits to the independent television companies. So the unions could happily go to the managements and say, look, which would you rather do? Give us the money or give the government the money? Because sure as hell they're not going to appreciate it. Wouldn't you like to give it to us? And the managements naturally would say, what a damn good idea. Splendid chaps. Yes, of course we'll shovel up the money. Except they were taking a bit themselves. I mean, we mustn't lose sight of that. Okay. And the result of that was all sorts of working practices that built up. The Musicians' Union was one of the strongest unions of its kind because during the war years and previously there had been no strength and unions were, musicians were very badly treated. Nobody would deny anything other than that. I mean, even up till the late 70s, the Marquee Club in London, London's Wardour Street, you know, they would offer a gig to act and say, but you're playing the Marquee. How wonderful. You know, you'll do it for free, won't you? Because look at the record dates you'll get, and you'll get this, and you'll get that. Musicians were, and perhaps still are in some ways, exploited. And a man with tremendous vision called Hardy Ratcliffe decided that he was not going to allow his members to be exploited in this way, and all power to him. But of course, you know, all power corrupts, and total power corrupts absolutely, or whatever the expression is. And they got to a point where the money coming in from the license fee and the request of the Musicians' Union to support their members didn't balance up. In a normal company, you know, when your books don't balance, you go to the wall. What happened with the BBC was they had to keep going back and asking for more license money. In the days when there was a radio license, in other words, the money could come in, all right? So in order to satisfy the Musicians' Union, and Equity were doing the same thing, and the Writers' Guild and all the other unions, there had to be a means whereby, to avoid strikes, you had to devise alternative methods, which were connived at by the unions. In other words, they were accepted, they were agreed, because probably the extra money they get out of it was not that significant to the musicians, but the amount saved was very significant to the BBC. Now that's frankly the history. This is a nonsense. It doesn't happen in Europe, it doesn't happen in America, it doesn't happen in Australia. But the control of gramophone records and the support of live musicians were unique to the UK. And that is remarkable. You know, we have got the finest standards of musicians anywhere in the world. No doubt about that. If you go and do a session, as I've done many in this country, the guys come in, they sit down, they read the dots, and 20 minutes of music in a 3-hour session, you've got first-class material. You can't do that in Italy. You certainly can't do it in Australia, and you'll be very lucky to get it out of America. What has happened is that we've got fine musicians, and foreign recordings came along and said, we want fine recordings, but we can't afford to pay for them. How do we get them? So, frankly, and this is where I start from, the whole business of foreign recordings was a device connived at by both managements and unions, and it kept things on the air. Now, somebody said to me, Tony, was it, who said, why not just have test tones for trade test material? Why not if they want music? Who asked me that? Somebody asked me it. It was Stuart. Stuart, why not just test tones? You know, what was the sense of having trade test music at all? Very good point. And the answer was, when television came on in the very late 30s, all they did have was test tones. And after the war, when the television service started again, the quality of gramophone records was such that the only music that was played on the air, unless material was really exceptional, was live music. You know, you obviously they did play gramophone records, but by and large, they tried to avoid playing gramophone records for all the reasons you know. If you were listening to Radio 2 this morning, you'd have heard some absolutely appalling quality of gramophone records played. God knows why, but they were. So, effectively, you couldn't play gramophone records on early trade tests. Now, if you think about it, the ability to record onto tape became available to the work towards the end of the war. Anybody know on what machine?
Wire recorders.
Yeah. No, before wire.
Then nearly steel.
Yeah, well that was the point Tony was making. Before wire. Who invented tape recording? Sorry? No. Yeah, somebody said it, the Germans. Yes? Yeah, it was the Germans. It was called a magnetophone. Wonderful term, you know. Magnetophone was the first form of tape recording. And interestingly, if those of you who read any of the BBC history, our correspondents were sending reports back cut on discs and continued to do so well after the war, while the Germans were sending stuff back on either early magnetophone recordings or, as Tony mentioned, wire recording. Now, wire recording overall was actually poorer quality than gramophone records, so you didn't really gain anything. And early tape recording, similarly so. And you will know that it takes the BBC a very long time to make up its mind about anything. And it took a very long time for them to be satisfied that tape could replace disc. You remember, perhaps in the mid-70s, there was a move back to direct cut discs. Do you remember that? And you know, there's still this feeling among classical anechoic ear engineers that, you know, there is only one pure sound, and that is that cut direct onto a disc. So all of this problem of what do you do with trade test transmissions when the engineers only wanted tones, well, you could produce a tone generator, but the fact was that a lot of people had to sit there and listen to it all day. And what's the result of sitting listening to tone all day? Well, we know the answer to that. You go quietly off your trolley, which explains why early BBC engineers were of a type. Right? I mean, in more serious points, you are well aware that the UK was taken to the Court of Human Justice because IRA suspects were being locked up with a bag over their head and test tones played into their ears. I mean, it makes you go off your trolley. It's not on. It's not a nice thing to do. So that's the answer, Stuart. I hope that's one answer I'll give it this afternoon, that unless you wanted every engineer running around with his Pi 13-channel black box trying to plug it in the new brave world of television, unless you wanted him to go off his rocker, you had to give him something else. So what did you give him? You gave him, ta-da, music. But how did you give him continuous music? Well, fortunately, the BBC has a lot of people. Still has, actually, even though they're disappearing. And so therefore, there were people who could stand there and lower pickups onto discs, right? But you still had this musicians' union problem. So what sort of discs could you lower them onto? Now, I wanted to bring with me today, if I could find one, and I couldn't, an example of the discs that we used for early trade test transmissions. Anybody know what they were? What was remarkable about them? You will have gathered this is an interactive session. You're not going to sit there and just look at me all afternoon, right? What was the first what was the first means of delivering more than one track at a time before the arrival of the LP? Anybody know?
The auto-text.
Possible, but no, it wasn't that. No, nor the jukebox. Wurlitzer was not allowed within the BBC. No. Sorry? No, something quite simple actually. Paul will probably have seen it. They were 16-inch discs. You saw them?
Yes, it's sound archives, yes.
Going round at 78 RPM. Now, right, a 10-inch or even a 12-inch disc going round at 78 RPM is pretty fearsome. 16 inches whipping round, okay, is not easy. And these discs were called V-discs. And they were made by the American Forces Network for entertaining their troops overseas. And therefore, recordings were made, cut direct onto these V-discs, and incidentally, foreign recordings have got a complete collection of them.
There's a huge pile
That's
of
right.
those lines still around in international recordings.
In terms of antique value, I suppose they're worth what somebody will pay for them. But that was if there's any friendly nut here who'd like to go along to the BBC, they're desperately short of money, as you know. We'd love to take some money off you. But seriously, they had huge players, and the Americans kept up with these V-discs for quite a long time. Anybody listen to Alan Dell on a regular basis here? Are you Alan Dell listeners? Right. He talks about V-discs, yeah? Well, that's what they were. And Alan Dell actually compiles a lot of his programs from foreign recordings, or as it's now called, international recordings. So that was the origin of how you got more than 3 minutes of music at a go into trade test transmissions, and it required somebody to stand there and drop the heading. The other ways that they did it, perhaps I should have brought an example with me. The Chinograph pencil. Prior to tape recording, where if you wanted a short piece of music, 10 seconds or a minute or whatever, what you would do is put a Chinograph mark on the disc. Are you familiar with Chinograph? They're like a wax pencil, yeah? The sort of thing you write the name of the roses on, in the garden to stop it washing off in the rain. You marked up the sequence that you wanted, and you became absolutely brilliant at dropping the pickup head on absolutely that point. And you do this live. Early Hancock programs, television. If you got da-da-da-da-da-da, remember it? Just in the middle sequence where you were pulling a scene together, there was some poor devil, sleeves rolled up, absolutely sweating, waiting for the director to go, and you get all these bum cuts, or what we would call bum cuts today. And the guy would have a little memo from the BBC saying, please make sure that your Chinograph markings are more accurate in future. And that was the skill of it, of really getting these little links in. From that, eventually, obviously, came the tapes. Now, you would know better than I when the first, quote, tape was produced for that use. Okay.
1955.
Right. Now, when I arrived in 73, I wanted to look at a particular area. And perhaps, would you mind if you'll be kind enough to turn the tape recorder off at this stage? I share that point with you because it was the fundamental change between what David Allen was asked to do and what I was asked to do. Now, David Allen started coded music. It would be very nice if David were here today. We're trying to work out, he retired when I was at the BBC, and my guess is that he would be just over 70 now, but a very remarkable man, because I'm like the second guy in the relay race, if you like, because David did all the hard work. He started coded music, he got it all together, and he got the concept going. I came along and was simply able to pick up on all the hard work that he'd done and move it forward and market it in a different way so that the local radio stations would play the material because it was presented not as coded music in a nice green bag, but as something called radio play with a nice, cover and so on, so that the jocks actually thought that they were playing, in effect, commercial music. They felt much warmer about it. It wasn't second-hand music. It wasn't music that was imposed on them. Okay, it was a different style of music. And the different style of music was achieved in this way. Instead of doing what David did, which was to go without any agreement from the Musicians' Union to studios overseas with British Musician Union members and make special recordings in order they could bring them back to use on coded music. What I did was to go abroad to Japan, to America, to Australia, and find recordings which had never been exploited commercially. Can I just be clear, and forgive me, I'm assuming certain knowledge that some of you may not have, but do you understand that when a Musicians' Union session is done, you can, on the air, you can play it once, you can repeat it, and then it has to be thrown away? Were you all aware of that? Okay, well, sorry, I should have made this very clear to you. The reason for this, the cost that you referred to, was that you would get 30, 40, 10, 20, 70 guys in a studio, and you would make a magnificent recording. It would be wonderful. And you could play it once, repeat it, and then throw it away. Literally. Physically. Dump. As in Amstrad typewriters into bin. Yes? Okay? I mean, you might have erased the tape, but you know what I mean. Gone, dead, not used, finish. And that explains why much of the stuff that Paul is after doesn't exist anymore. You know, very often this was the case, that one was asking for the impossible when foreign recordings was sent a letter saying, can you find this or can you find that? Because very often we were asked for stuff, you know, which was a normal session, not just trade test music or whatever. And in fact, for part of the time, we had so much music that we would put tracks onto tape and play it once and throw it away. The cost was phenomenal. I mean, I don't know what's a 20-minute session now cost? 60, 80 pounds?
It's about 60, 70 pounds per musician.
Right. I mean, in those days, we thought it was ridiculous to pay 30 quid. But I mean, if you've got, say, I don't know, let's be sensible and say 20 guys, you know, some sort of a big band, say, a 20-man lineup, you know, multiply that up by 30 pounds a head, add on the studio costs, you know, and all the overheads and personnel and national insurance and all of those things, and you begin to see where and why you desperately needed to do something to save money, because you're just throwing it away. It'd be like making a table, eating off it twice and junking it, you know. But that's the situation that I was referring to. That was the basis that Hardy Ratcliffe had got, and that incidentally still applies today with television programs. And it prevented you from going on, effectively, putting musicians out of business. Television programs, similarly. An actor, you get a play, a repeat, and then it's junked. If it's retained, as it does, you know, films are kept. If you want to play it again, it used to be 125% of original fee grossed up for today. I suspect it's probably 150% now. Because you see, in a small country like ours, what would happen was, once you got a great library of stuff, you wouldn't need to go on employing people, would you? Okay, so the Musicians' Union, with great vision and foresight, said, this is the deal we'll do on music. You can, and we'll also limit you, through Phonographic Performance Limited, PPL, on the number of gramophone records you can play. I mean, you're all aware that the BBC can't play all the gramophone records it wants to. You know, you're limited. And when I went to the States and started recovering music, the thing was that I wanted it for nothing. BBC always wants everything for nothing, you know. Like our friend's shirt over there, the salaries come in small checks, you know. I wanted it for nothing. But what was I going to give back? Why would anybody give me something for nothing? You know? And the answer was the performing rights fees. Now, to actually get on to a trade test tape and have your stuff going out day after day, night after night, was worth a couple of bob. In fact, it was worth quite a lot. I mean, anybody know, for instance, today, what does it cost the BBC for 3 minutes of music on Radio 1? What do you think? What do you think the publisher gets?
30, 40.
You're right. It's about £42. okay, at 20 records an hour, roughly, you begin to see the cost of broadcasting on a national network I'm talking about. Obviously, it's much less for local radio. But that's the sort of mazuma that was sloshing about. So when I was going and saying, give me your material, you know, if we can get it onto Radio 2, it's going to generate for you at that time 25 quid every time it's played. Ching ching, the wallet, right? It's money, fellas. I appreciate that your interest is, to quote Stuart, of an artistic nature. Their interest was as far from anything artistic as it was possible to get. You know, they were there, they were in it for the money. And it is true to say that on occasions, certain members of a certain union would negotiate hard for stopping this process from continuing, and then the following day get in their car, drive to Dover, go over to Trixie Studios in Cologne, and do endless sessions because there were no limitations on the continent. So I share that with you so you understand. I hope I'm not pricking anybody's image or bubbles or idealism about this, but the fact is that the basis for coded music and radio play and so on was purely a financial one. It was big business and it was big money.
Forgive me, you said coded music. I don't know what coded music is.
Forgive me. Please stop me. Will you please make a point? And thank you for doing it. I'm assuming a certain knowledge because you've given me such a bashing over lunchtime. I'm convinced you know much more about it than I do. Music that was recorded abroad by David Allen and the publishers, they set up special sessions to do this, you see, was called coded music. And it appeared, they were 12-inch LPs, and if they were lucky, because in terms of economies, they get 16 tracks on one side, and they really shoved a bit. Talk about digital compression these days. I mean, this was really it, okay? And it appeared in a standard, you know, the inside sleeve of an LP with just a number on the outside. You will know what those numbers were. Was it CRM or something?
CM or CMS if it was coded music stereo.
There I see. I told you he knew more about it than I did. Okay, and I mean they look very boring. You know when you go into a library and you look for books or you look for records. Very often you choose the music, at least initially, by what the cover looks like. Okay, so if you go into a cupboard and from there to there, all you can see is just a solid phalanx of green sleeves. You know. Then you don't play them very often, do you? You know, if you're a poor bloody disc jockey, you think, God, I can't be bothered with that lot. I tell you what, I'll play, I don't know, I Left My Heart in San Francisco and I'll call it coded music, CRM, whatever. Now, there was all sorts of deals and dodges going on. So that's what coded music was. When I came along, I recognized that if we were going to get the guys to play it, because that was the key thing, then we had to repackage it and market it, and also acquire material of a much more entertaining nature. Now, you guys were writing to us at the rate of about 20 to 30 letters a week. And the engineers were saying, God, this music is awful. Can't you do something about this musette? Da 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 dum dum. I tell you, tones. If you don't go off your head listening to tones, just imagine that fucking dog barking at you every, So it was driving them absolutely bonkers, right? He said, please, will you give us something that we're entertaining? The guys out on the streets, the BREMA guys, British Retail Electrical Manufacturers Association, they were the people who were running around installing sets, and lining them up and so on. They were saying, yeah, we've got a tone generator, we've got a crosshatch generator, we've got all of those things, but for a period of our lives, we have to stand and listen to this rubbish. Couldn't you give us something better? Couldn't you make it more entertaining? Part of taking on the problem that I mentioned to you before, which was to look for material specifically for Radio 2, meant that we also generated a quantity of vocal material. And we put some vocal material into the tapes, and you guys, enthusiasts, all went into the corner. I hate this, But unfortunately for us, they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Our 20 to 30 letters then shot up to 100 letters a week. Absolutely mad, you know. So we then had to get in an extra secretary to deal with them. And those of you who rang up will have talked to my secretary, Marilyn, who is in incredible health, I may tell you, and living in Croydon. You know, used to sit there, apart from having to type out these damn things, these P as Bs, that they're called, programs as broadcasts, or P as Rs, programs as recorded sheets. She also had to answer these frustrating letters with people saying, you know, little Johnny really loves this track. It's, you know, when it comes on, he's really thrilled. I've got to buy it for him. You know, please, can you help me? And you write back, dear madam, you've had them all. You know, the most frustrating and awful thing, most dissatisfying job in that sense. So the more entertaining we made it, the worse we made it for ourselves. The more pleasure we gave the listeners and the engineers, you know, the worse we made it for ourselves. It gave us more hard work. And I can understand now why, in our efforts to please, today, where resources are even tighter as well, you know, in your own companies, I would think that foreign recordings are very relieved that there's only half an hour a day. That you know, they don't have these overheads and worries, which after all are substitute for tones. But the people who are most worried are people to whom I would pay personal tribute here, who helped me tremendously and made it all happen. People like Irving Wilson, Sid Dale, Frank Chaxfield, John Nice of Valentine Music, and many others, Trevor Littleton. They're the guys who've lost out because what happened? It doesn't go in there anymore, right? And the only use they have for their recordings are for inclusion in commercials, in film tracks, and, you know, in production studios, that sort of thing. And of course, therefore, the number of sessions, because there wasn't enough money going in the pocket, the number of sessions that are being recorded these days are now very, very, very much fewer. So, to all of those people who said, please, 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 can you send me a record? These were the sorts of things, you will recognize them, that I want them back. These are the sorts of things, hundreds of them, the sorts of things, the sessions that were being played, and were therefore the basis on which this whole connivance at getting round the Musicians' Union, because that's what it was, existed. And the annoying thing was, there were people out there who were listening. The annoying thing was, there were people like you who wanted entertaining. The annoying thing was, we wanted you to shut up and go away. But at the same time, we also wanted to try and fulfill some part of our remit, which was to stop the engineers from going off their trolleys, you see. So there we are. So that, broadly speaking, is the background. Now, over lunch, people have talked to me, Malcolm has talked to me about trade test transmissions. You've talked to me about various bits of television, but oh joy, not a single one of you has mentioned the interludes to me. Are you obsessed by the interludes as well, any of you?
Very fond.
Yes? Yes. Right. Okay. Do you know, I mean, you obviously know why they were there, because the resources were very small. They only had about 3 cameras, and if they wanted to move a camera or go to another scene, you know, they had to pull the cameras out of this set and push them next door into the next studio so that they could continue with the play or whatever. And that's why the interludes were there. And the interludes consisted of a kitten playing with a ball of wool, or the sea rolling in, or what others were there? I can't remember. Sorry?
Fish. Angel.
Oh yes, the angel fish.
Windmill.
Potter's wheel, yes. The windmill, right. This is Trivial Pursuit, right? Anybody want to go for a 6? Yes. Sorry? Road was that one?
Yes, piano playtime.
Really? Oh yes, the piano playtime. That's right. Yes. Well, I read all about this in a book. I don't know anything about this. I'm too young myself. But those interludes were a function of a failure to service the BBC, because what was happening was the government was creaming off 50% of the license fee. Did you know that? It started as a tax. And what happened, if I just briefly tell you, funding for music actually came out of the licence fee as it stood. Now, the licence fee was a brilliant invention of the government in 1922, how to raise money. And they started the radio licence. But it wasn't a BBC licence, as indeed it isn't today. If any of you actually read the bit of paper, it's a licence to receive wireless telegraphy. Wonderful, isn't it? That's wonderfully civil service. And it started to generate quite a lot of money. And after the war, and particularly at the beginning of television, the money started coming in great chunks. And the government creamed off 50% of it. Then later, in the mid-60s, I suppose, things were getting going, and the BBC said, we want more money. Now, there was no votes in putting up the licence fee, so the government then started to give more and more to the BBC. But it was actually only in 1976 that the BBC started to get 100% of the money for the licence fee. So up to that time, from 1922 to 1976, it had been a jolly good way of getting an extra bit of money, a bit like sort of poll tax, I suppose, today, extra bit of money into government coffers. And that money then, coming in, meant that the BBC could buy more cameras. And when they got sufficient cameras, they didn't need the interludes. It's all rather sad, really, wasn't it? And thus, the story is writ large again. But what happened? The people who recorded the music for those interludes, right, which, surprise, surprise, because they were played so often, happened to be certain sessions recorded abroad, they too disappeared. And oh dear, once again, the publishers lost out. Right? And the man who actually banned the interludes was a man called Rex Moorfoot, who taught me probably more than I've ever known, as it were, in broadcast television and radio. A quite brilliant man, absolutely excellent man, who is responsible actually for the whole style of television presentation, probably right around the world. He really was a brilliant man, now I suppose in his very late 70s, but still a quite remarkable man. And even in his late 70s, acts as chairman of ACAS committees. Brilliant man. And those who work in television would say, oh, Moorfoot, wonderful. Poor old Moorfoot, he banned the interludes. He got 10,000 letters on his desk 3 days later. do you know how much, anybody work in the post office here? I mean, do you know how much room 10,000 letters takes up? It's a hell of a lot. On the basis, when you think about it in your own office, how long does it take you to answer a letter? Half an hour? Even if you got form letters, there were no word processing in those days. Everyone had to be, you couldn't send out a carbon letter. You couldn't send out, because it wasn't the BBC style, to send out one of those sort of blue duplicated things on the Spirit duplicator. Every single person had to be replied to individually. This took up an army of typists. But he stuck to his guns and said, look, this is a nonsense, because with competition coming for us, in the shape of independent television, the last thing we want is interlude. We want to keep the customer, remember, that's me talking, I'll tell you that story in a minute, the customer, otherwise known as the listener or the viewer, we want to keep him on our channel, and therefore the last thing we want to do is do anything to make him switch off, go out, have a cup of tea, go to the loo, or whatever. So the interludes went, and with it the money. So I only tell you this story only because history keeps repeating itself. It really does. There'll be some version of this in times to come. And I just find it intriguing, as a lover of BBC history, to see how many times the BBC makes old mistakes. Anybody who's been on a management course, the first thing they tell you is you can be forgiven for making new mistakes, but you can never be forgiven for making old ones. Right? History repeating itself is simply another way of saying that you made an old mistake. And I'm sure, the Bee, once again, will go on making old mistakes. It's that sort of organisation. I mean, don't you like the Talkback programme, where they invite you to write in, and then they tell you why you're wrong? I mean, have you ever heard the BBC say, oh gosh, that play by so-and-so, was really a bit over there. I'm really sorry about those 4-letter words. Or what? Have you ever heard that? Absolutely wrong. The BBC will tell you why you're wrong on all occasions. And I think truthfully, as an aside, we're going to see the most enormous change in the BBC over years, where it has to satisfy fewer people, but more of the time, because there's be so much competition. You know, if ITV gets it wrong, they do the same thing. They'll tell you why you're wrong. That's because ITV recruits everybody from the BBC who gives the best training in the world, right? I mean, have you ever thought about that? You know, we have the best. How many of you agree with the statement, we have the best television programmes in the world? Put your hand up. Anybody?
The least worst.
All right. Very good point. Who tells you that we have the best television programmes in the world? Right. Who tells us, who has over history told us that we have the best? The BBC. Right? We believe them. You know, it's all part of our xenophobia. We go abroad to Tenerife on holiday or, you know, Southwest Hartlepool or somewhere. And we turn the television on and, oh God, they're not speaking English for a start. And even in America, they've got a funny accent. I think that's the worst television programs I've ever seen. It's absolute rubbish. Not only that, they advertise in the middle. Quite disgusting. You know, we go on telling ourselves as Brits that we have the best television. Now, you are right. I'm sorry, sir. I don't know your name in the check shirt. Anne? Andy. Andy, you were right. That original quote, do you know where it came from?
Milton Schulman.
Absolutely right. Milton Schulman, the Evening Standard critic, invented the line, "We have the least worst television in the world." And the BBC, in the shape of Hugh Carlton Green, wrote to him and said, "How brilliant you are in your assessment of British television being the best in the world." And they went on television, they said, "We've got the best television in the world," and Milton Schulman said so. And he kept saying, "No, I didn't. No. I said it was..." Shut up. Poor Milton, every time he tried to open his mouth on the Simon D show, remember him, or any of those, the Eamon Andrews show, you know, the very moment he tried to say, "But I didn't say that," they'd say, "Yes, right, well, we'll have to move along now. We've run out of time. You know, it's time to go to the news or something." It's one poor old Schulman. I feel really quite sorry for him. We are a nation conned by the BBC, and we're willingly conned because we like it, because we're British, and we think we're the best in the world anyway, about our programmes. Okay. Somebody asked me, and it may have been Stuart again over lunch, about the motivation that I had for choosing the music. Was it you, Stuart? I think so. The answer was, I'm as big a nut as you are, in that probably the happiest time in my life of any job that I've had, possibly even including the present one, which is most enjoyable, and I'll tell you about that if you're interested. The happiest time in my life was spent in foreign recordings. Can you think? I mean, it's like the kid in the chocolate factory, you know. Suddenly they gave me a job which had a lot of other responsibilities besides this, but for part of my life, at any rate, they threw open the sweetie shop and said, like pick and mix, you know, have any you want. Compile them onto tape, you do anything you like. Oh, and by the way, if you don't like those, you can go abroad, go anywhere you like in the world, you know, go and talk to Henry Mancini, go and talk to Frank Sinatra, go and talk to anybody you like, and get the music that you think is right for Radio 2. And then come back and compile it. I mean, what a joy. So the motivation, Stuart, to answer your question, is what motivated me to put one tape in one record in front of another was very little analysis except by musical coding. In other words, I tried to avoid horrible key changes and segues, but didn't always succeed. And really my own personal choice. I liked that bit in front of that bit, and I did quite enjoy listening to that bit next. And so, I mean, there was no real mystique to it, any more than there is a mystique to you choosing the Clarnico peppermint creams over the barley sugars. You know, it was purely personal taste. And had I had an audience, such as yourselves, actually you'd probably give me a very hard time, you know, that I could have discussed my choice of music with, or, you know, even thought about my choice of music, or why I put one in front of the other, I no doubt would have been a very, very much better compiler than I was. But I certainly enjoyed it, very much indeed. I've given you the reason why vocals, but there is another reason to why vocals. I was very, very impressed with a company called Bonneville Broadcasting. They operate in the States and they provide automated radio. In many of their stations, they had 15-minute back announcements of what you just heard. And very often they would, just say what the record was available, or alternatively would say, ring up our telephone number and we'll tell you the records we've just played and where you can get them from. I mean, it was a wonderful service. And I thought, God, now this is the sort of radio I would like to put together. Quite impossible in the UK because you've got to have so many live sessions, you can only have very few records, and of course the cheapest thing on radio is what? Talk. Thank you. The cheapest thing on radio is talk. When you're only allowed to put out maybe 8 or 9 records in an hour, okay, that's 24 minutes. You've got to invent a lot of other things to fill up your hour's program. You know, things like, I mean, why was Wogan successful? Wogan was successful because without any scripting and without any support and without any researchers, he could sit there and blarney in the morning, right? He had no script, he had no ideas, he didn't even have a piece of paper in front of him. He was brilliant, okay? That's what made him good. Jimmy Young has 5 researchers. Ever heard the credits for the Jimmy Young show? He has 5 guys working on it. Or 5 girls, I should say, honorary guys, if you know what I mean. And they interview the Prime Minister, and they interview the man about the vegetables, and they interview the doctor. Anything to avoid playing music, because music is terribly, terribly expensive. So, really, there was more to your question than just, why choose that particular piece of music. Why vocals was to make it more entertaining and not lose people also to commercial radio. Remember Capital Radio came on in 1973? I have to tell you, I work for them now, so it's quite amusing. But there was also this feeling that anything that the BBC could do to not lose listeners, even if it meant them listening to the trade test tapes instead of listening to Capital or LBC or the local radio stations outside the UK, was of value. And even if you had to put up 5 minutes of tone, because that was the deal we had with the Musicians' Union, to, as it were, cut off people, to make them switch away. I mean, that 5 minutes of tone was a deal with the Musicians' Union. Never written down anywhere, but that was it. Do you think the engineers wanted 5 minutes of tone? You're an engineer, do you want 5 minutes of tone?
I thought that the audio...
Yeah, 5 minutes.
I thought the tone was the most useful, from the engineer's point of view, more useful to them than the actual music.
They had tone generators. What do they need tone for?
Well,
they had crosshatch generators.
If I can interrupt, I
Yes.
thought just about every TV service in places, the sound was always turned down.
Precisely.
Why
And
they had
why?
a sign up saying an announcement in sound is now being made.
That's right. And why? Because you had this great chunk of 5 minutes of tone where the shop assistants were springing to the sets to turn them all down. It wasn't actually intended, really, to be an entertainment medium, except during the top of the hour and the 55 minutes. And then, of course, they switched back to radio. So do understand, and forgive me if I stress this to you, most of what I'm talking about, the motivation for your pleasure was political. It was political, it was pecuniary. All right? The joy that I've got is sitting here and knowing that you guys got a hell of a buzz out of all of this. I mean, that really is to me a tremendous pleasure. But the fact was, going back to Bonneville for a moment, the pleasure for me was that there were no disc jockeys, no wittering. Nobody needed to do the 8-bar intro. This desperate need to talk from the start of the record up to the vocal intro. Why? Do you know why that happened? Anybody know why that occurred? What sort of people?
Well, people want the general public.
No.
People that were recording the raw material, so they want to enter the...
No. Something much more fundamental than this. Yes, which other companies?
Record companies or whatever.
No, not the record companies.
Television?
No. Shall I tell you? All right. The competition to get records first in the USA, the latest records, between the radio stations was enormous. They would pay, there was payola, I don't need to tell you that. There was all sorts of backdoor deals. People were paid in airline tickets, which they then took to the airport and cashed in order to get the money out. You know, and that if you talked over the record, it stopped the competing radio station from playing it. And that's how this whole art form, because that's what the jocks think of it as, I did. I thought it was a great art form. Aren't I wonderful? I haven't crashed the vocal. You know, that's how that came. Again, political and pecuniary. It all comes back to it in the end.
Can I just ask
Yes,
a
please.
question?
How am I doing? God, I've got to leave here in 5 minutes.
All this general, there are two things. Firstly, all this general point about being made current, recordings are actually made abroad. But I noticed on some of the BBC lists for about certainly the late 1950s and certain lists, they're actually off BBC 78s or off BBC LPs. Doesn't mean they're actually taken abroad from the BBC Soundhouse and made there and returned. Or
You mean the records? The records physically?
Yes.
Yeah, the records were made at Sonaton in Germany. Now the biggest compact disc plant.
Even if they were BBC?
Oh, well, that was where they were made, you see.
Oh, I see.
They were actually manufactured, because you couldn't have EMI making them. That would have blown the story, wouldn't it?
Oh, I see. And the other two questions, I thought the toning signal was especially to help the engineers test the sound, because the RTA, when they first started, from 1957 to roughly April 1960, they used to have their toning signals every quarter of an hour.
That's right. That's right. You're not wrong.
And then that was all taken down above. The BBC never did that. Then it was all taken down to 5 minutes again. So it was partly to do with getting.
Oh, absolutely. Jolly good reason. Let's all justify it, chaps.
On the early television sets, I suppose they just had converters on, so the RTA would have had to have more tone in, really.
Look, I've got a whole load of things I haven't even begun to say here. And, you know, the US influence, the service bands, I can't deal with that, unfortunately. Maybe on another occasion. You know, PPL, the oral history of the BBC, BBC attitudes, and so on. What I would like to do, forgive me, but I'm making another presentation at 6 o'clock. It's going to take me an hour and a half to get back to Coventry. I've got half an hour to jump in a dinner jacket and get there. So I'm going to ask you if you'll accept 5 minutes of questions. Incidentally, can I just show you these? Remember these things? These were made for trade test discs. The early chapel stuff. But what I would like to do, before I go, if I may, I'd like to do something that whenever you were at the BBC, they always said, sod off, you can't have it. Here is a non-DPL record, which, I have to tell you, I'll be very honest with you, is my wife's publishing company, and it's never been played on the BBC because, naturally, you could not plug material of your own on the BBC, because that would be, at the very least, immoral. This is where we got one. Who has the other go? Okay. Right, yes. Who has it? Anybody not got one? Can I please have my 2 Moon Music LPs back for my old chapel records? Who's had the KPM and the Amphonic records away? I will just check and see whether a cardboard replica has been put in instead.
No, we wouldn't do a thing like that.
Incidentally, if you're wanting to go into mood music today, there's only one way to do it. You have to produce compact discs. Funny enough, I said to you, history keeps repeating itself. These are made at Sonaton in Germany. Sorry, we're going to...
John Pretty, actually, I've got some songs on record, and John Pretty is for the publisher of this country.
Yeah.
John, very...
Right.
Just a quick, what are you doing now at Capital Radio?
Oh, I run a company called Satellite Media Services, and what it does is it provides satellite circuits for the broadcasters, for independent radio, hopefully BBC Radio. It's a new company. It's been in operation for 4 months. It's doing quite nicely, thank you. You'll be delighted to know. And its aim is to produce a system of satellite distribution of radio signals apart from in the UK, over to Europe so everybody can exchange material without going through the lovely BT. But also it's an idea for developing tourist radio. To those who are involved in advertising perhaps, very difficult to sell, say, Maxwell House coffee if you've only got 150,000 listeners, say, in Monte Carlo. But if you could actually get, for example, say, Capital Radio, going out from the Greek islands right round to Tenerife, you could offer an audience of about 5 million. Okay? A, it would make you very happy when you went overseas, if you like Capital Radio, that is. And B, you can then fund it because you can sell national adverts, you know, and have local adverts inserted for restaurants or, you know, local pastimes overseas. So that's what I'm doing. It's a brand new thing, and it's absolutely fascinating. And it's part of Radio Tomorrow, but not Radio Today. Thank you very much for putting up with my nonsense. Please will you forgive me, may I creep away, but can I say that if you have another one of these, I would be delighted not only to return if you want me to, but I'd like to help perhaps in contacting one or two other people who have got actually a great deal more to contribute than I have. But I leave you with just one thought. I'm really quite proud that you've asked me, only because you recognise in me that I'm as big a loony as you are. Thank you. Thank you.